There is a category of weapon that changes the mathematics of a conflict, not because of what it can do in a single engagement, but because of what it can do in 10,000 engagements simultaneously. The Shahed 136 loitering munition, the weapon that Iranian engineers had developed, refined, exported, and then produced at a rate that Western defense analysts had consistently underestimated until the evidence from active conflict zones made underestimation professionally untenable, was that category of weapon. Cheap enough to manufacture by the thousands, accurate enough to strike a specific room in a specific building at a specific grid coordinate, slow enough that any competent air defense system could engage it individually, numerous enough that no air defense system, regardless of competence or inventory depth, could engage all of them simultaneously when they arrived in coordinated swarms that saturated the engagement capacity of every system defending a target simultaneously. The mathematics of saturation had been demonstrated repeatedly in proxy conflicts where Iranian-supplied drones had been employed against defended targets. The mathematics were not in dispute. What was in dispute, for a period long enough to become strategically consequential, was where the production capacity that was generating those numbers was located. Shahid Babaei Air Base sits southwest of Avaz in the Khuzestan province, close enough to the Iraqi border that its location had always been understood as having both offensive and defensive implications for Iranian military planning in the Western theater. The base's surface infrastructure, its runways, its maintenance hangars, its fuel storage and administrative buildings, had been satellite imaged continuously for years and presented nothing that the imagery analysts had not cataloged and assessed. What the imagery analysts had not cataloged, because the imagery did not show it, was the underground complex that Iranian military engineers had constructed beneath the base's southwestern apron over a period of 9 years, using the base's routine construction activity as cover for the excavation spoil disposal and the equipment movements that any underground construction program of that scale necessarily generates. The complex was not a generic hardened facility. It was purpose-built for a specific function: the storage, maintenance, fusing, and pre-launch preparation of loitering munitions in quantities that exceeded anything the intelligence community had previously assessed as a single-site capability. When the human intelligence source whose reporting finally established the complex's existence and layout was assessed as reliable enough to support a targeting decision, the inventory estimate that accompanied the layout data produced a number that caused the analysts who reviewed it to check their source validation protocols before accepting it. The number was correct. The complex housed a stockpile that, if it reached operational deployment, represented a single launch capacity large enough to simultaneously saturate the air defense systems of every major U.S. installation in the region. That number was the reason the targeting decision was made in the time it was made. The facility's architecture had been designed with the awareness that its contents made it a high priority target. The design philosophy was not purely passive hardening, the approach that earlier Iranian underground facilities had relied on, and that the GBU-57 had rendered strategically obsolete. The Shahid Babaei complex incorporated an active deception layer. The storage chambers were offset laterally by 230 meters from the surface structures that would suggest their location to a targeting analyst, positioned beneath a section of base perimeter that imagery characterized as drainage management infrastructure. A weapon aimed at the obvious surface indicators would miss the actual chambers by a margin that, at the depths involved, was decisive. The deception had worked for 9 years. It worked until the human intelligence reporting provided a layout that included the offset coordinates. The mission that was assembled against those coordinates was unusual in its weapons employment architecture, for a reason that distinguished it from previous deep strike packages. The lateral offset of the chambers from any obvious surface reference point meant that the GPS-guided weapons release solution had to be computed against a subsurface aim point derived from the human intelligence layout, rather than against any surface feature that the targeting sensors could independently verify during the attack. The weapons were going to a coordinate that existed in a document, not at a location that any onboard sensor could confirm. The confidence the mission required was not in the aircraft or the weapons or the EW package. It was in the intelligence. The planners had assessed the source. The source had been assessed. The mission was authorized. The B-2 Spirit that drew the mission lifted off at 9:38 p.m. The aircraft carried 2 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators configured for the specific geological profile of the Khuzestan alluvial plain, a soil and sediment substrate fundamentally different from the granite and limestone formations that had characterized previous deep penetration targets, and one that required a fuzing algorithm adjustment that the weapons engineers had initially assessed as straightforward and had subsequently revised twice as the geological survey data from the target area revealed a stratigraphy more variable than the regional surveys had indicated. The variability was in the boundary layer between the alluvial sediment and the underlying bedrock, a transition zone whose depth and density characteristics were not uniform across the lateral extent of the underground chambers. The final fusing solution was a compromise between two depth estimates that differed by 11 meters, weighted toward the shallower estimate by a factor derived from the sediment density measurements at the closest available survey point. The engineer who computed it described the solution, in his technical documentation, as the best available answer to an incompletely characterized problem. His documentation also noted that the best available answer was, in his professional assessment, sufficient. It was included in the mission package with that qualification attached. The pilot had read the qualification. He had read everything in the mission package with the systematic attention that distinguished aviators who had survived long careers in this aircraft from those who had not. The fusing qualification was operationally relevant. The second weapons employment solution had a dependency on the first weapon's results that would not be resolvable from the cockpit. The first weapon would go to its computed aim point. The second would follow on a modified solution computed from the first weapon's penetration telemetry, an encrypted data stream transmitted from weapon to aircraft during the penetration sequence, incorporated into the GBU-57's design specifically for sequential employment. If the link performed as designed, the second weapon would have a corrected solution. He noted the dependency. He taxied to the runway. The routing to Shahid Babaei from the forward operating location required 11 hours and 44 minutes. The western approach to Khuzestan ran through airspace monitored by Iraqi radar infrastructure and covered at the Iranian boundary by a defense network oriented specifically toward threats from the west. The mission routing addressed this by approaching from the south, transiting international airspace over the northern Arabian Sea, and entering Iranian airspace at an angle to the primary coverage sectors. The southern approach added 40 minutes to the total flight time. The 40 minutes were a margin, not a cost. The first tanker contact occurred at 1:17 a.m. over the central Arabian Sea, a routine transfer in benign conditions that completed in 14 minutes. The pilot ate his second meal of the sortie during the transfer, not because he was hungry, but because the fueling window was the last opportunity for caloric intake before the threat phase began. And the flight surgeons had been unambiguous about the relationship between blood glucose levels and fine motor precision at hour 11 of a sustained flight. He ate the meal. He did not taste it. The tanker departed south and the B-2 continued north. The EW package that supported the penetration had been assembled from carrier-based and land-based assets in a configuration that the mission planners had designed specifically for the Khuzestan approach geometry. The primary challenge was not the Iranian systems. The defense network around Shahid Babaei was capable, but not as deeply layered as the networks protecting the nuclear and command facilities in the interior. The primary challenge was the commercial radar environment. The air traffic control infrastructure in the region generated a persistent background of interrogation pulses that the B-2's passive warning system had to continuously discriminate against to identify genuine threat emissions. Discrimination was automated and had been functioning reliably for years, but the specific frequency environment of the Khuzestan approach corridor had not been mapped at the detail level the mission required until 6 weeks before the execution order, when a dedicated signals intelligence collection sortie had generated the frequency library that the passive warning system would use during the penetration. The library was loaded into the aircraft's defensive management system during the pre-flight checks. The pilot verified the load. The library was current. At 8:14 p.m. local time, the mission was flying east into a time zone differential that had been advancing the local clock throughout the sortie. The lead elements of the EW package activated against the outer coverage sector of the Shahid Babaei defense network. The activation sequence followed the frequency management protocol developed from the Signals Intelligence Library. Initial suppression of the long-range early warning radars covering the southern approach corridor, followed by step suppression of the medium-range acquisition radars as the B-2 entered their coverage range, followed by point defense suppression in the terminal phase. The protocol was not improvised. It had been rehearsed against a replica emitter array at a range facility where the Iranian frequency parameters had been replicated with sufficient fidelity that the EW officers flying the mission had run this exact sequence 11 times before flying it for real. The Iranian air defense response to the initial jamming activation was faster than the rehearsals had modeled. The long-range early warning operators, executing a frequency management drill that their unit had been running weekly since a command directive issued 4 months earlier, had mandated increased EW resilience training, cycled through their backup frequencies in a sequence that the rehearsal modeling had assigned a mean response time of 42 seconds. The actual response time was 19 seconds. The EW officer on the lead growler received the frequency shift data from the signals intelligence platform 11 seconds after the shift occurred and adjusted his jamming allocation in 4 seconds. 8 seconds of partially degraded coverage on the early warning layer. The B-2 was 3 minutes from entering that layer's coverage when the gap opened, and 2 minutes, 32 seconds from that same position when the gap closed. The gap did not expose the aircraft. The gap was noted by the Growler EW officer in his mission log as a response time anomaly that the post-mission debrief would need to address for future planning purposes. He noted it and continued. The point defense layer around Shahid Babaei consisted of 2 HQ-7 batteries and a single Raad medium-range system that the imagery had placed on the base's northern perimeter. The HQ-7 batteries received their suppression from the land-based EW asset operating from the Gulf Partner Airfield. The Raad system was the Growler's responsibility. At 8:31 p.m. local time, as the B-2 entered the inner defense ring, the Raad system's acquisition radar produced an anomalous return at the edge of its detection envelope. Not a track, but a return that fell above the noise floor in a manner that the system's automatic classification algorithm flagged as requiring operator review. The operator reviewed it. The return was present for 2 consecutive sweeps and absent on the third. 2 returns, no third, in a heavy jamming environment. The operator's training produced the correct assessment and the incorrect conclusion simultaneously. The correct assessment was that the return was real. The incorrect conclusion was that it was a drone, a reconnaissance unmanned system that the operator's experience with regional threat patterns told him was more consistent with the signature profile than a manned aircraft. He reported a possible drone contact, requested authorization for a visual confirmation pass by the alert fighter, and waited for the authorization. The authorization request traveled up the Shahid Babaei command chain to the base air defense officer, who looked at a possible drone contact in a heavy jamming environment on a night when his early warning layer had been experiencing frequency interference, and made the calculation that every air defense officer at every installation in Iran had been trained to make. A drone contact in isolation was a surveillance event. A drone contact simultaneous with broad spectrum, jamming across multiple frequency bands, was potentially a targeting event, the reconnaissance element of a strike package establishing the terminal picture before the strike assets arrived. He issued an immediate base defense alert at 8:33 p.m. and authorized the Raad system to transition to active fire control mode. The Raad's fire control radar came up at 8:34 p.m. The B-2's passive warning receiver classified the emission in 3 seconds and presented the pilot with a threat symbol he recognized: active fire control medium range system, bearing that placed the emitter on the base perimeter ahead and to his right. He was 4 minutes and 50 seconds from the initial point. The mission commander transmitted the contingency code that tasked the Growler flight with maximum output jamming on the Raad's fire control frequency. The Growler responded in 6 seconds. The Raad's fire control pictures degraded. The system's operator reported jamming on the fire control frequency and switched to his backup. The Growler was 3 seconds behind the switch, 3 seconds during which the Raad's fire control radar swept on a clear frequency twice. 2 sweeps. No acquisition. The B-2 was outside the Raad's effective detection range for a non-cooperative target at the current approach geometry by a margin of approximately 4 kilometers. Close enough that the threat symbol on the pilot's display represented a genuine engagement possibility. Not close enough that the Raad's 2 clean sweeps had produced the return strength required for a weapons quality track. The system was looking in the right place. It was looking at a target that was 4 kilometers beyond the range at which looking produced a usable answer. The Growler's jamming on the backup frequency restored full suppression at 8:34 p.m. and 41 seconds. The Raad's picture degraded again. The base air defense officer, monitoring the engagement from the command post, saw his fire control radar's picture collapse twice in 41 seconds and his early warning layer functioning at degraded capacity across 3 frequency bands simultaneously. He picked up the direct line to the regional air defense sector and reported a possible penetration event, confidence moderate, requesting immediate sector support. The sector controller acknowledged and began the response sequence. The response sequence would produce additional assets in the area in 14 minutes. The weapons release timeline required 3 minutes and 20 seconds. The sequencing was not in the base air defense officer's favor. The initial point was at 8:37 p.m. The pilot ran his pre-release checks in the compressed timeline that the alert status required, faster than the standard sequence but complete, every item confirmed. The targeting system's GPS solution updated against the subsurface aim point coordinates from the intelligence layout and presenting a circular error that the system's display characterized as within acceptable parameters. The bay doors open. The first GBU-57 released. The aircraft pitched up, and the pilot corrected the attitude in the same practiced motion that 15 tons of departing weapon always required. The bay doors began cycling closed. The first weapon's telemetry link activated at weapon separation and transmitted penetration data throughout its flight and into the ground. The data stream reached the aircraft's weapons management system in real time. Acceleration, deceleration, material transitions, depth estimates computed from the deceleration profile. The alluvial sediment layer was shallower than the pre-mission survey had suggested by 6 meters, within the range of the geological variability that the fuzing engineer had documented, but at the edge of it. The boundary layer between sediment and bedrock was at 41 meters rather than the 47-meter estimate that had generated the compromised fuzing solution. The weapons management system ingested the telemetry, recomputed the second weapon's optimal detonation depth against the corrected stratigraphy, and updated the second weapon's fuzing parameters. In the 11 seconds between the first weapon's surface impact and the second weapon's planned release, the telemetry link had performed as designed. The qualification in the engineer's documentation did not matter. The corrected solution was loaded. The second GBU-57 released from the forward station 31 seconds after the first, the minimum interval required for the first weapon's penetration channel to stabilize sufficiently to guide the second weapon, without the channel geometry interfering with the second weapon's terminal flight path. The aircraft turned onto the egress heading before the second weapon's bay door had finished its closing cycle. Below the southwestern apron of Shahid Babaei Air Base, 2 physics sequences were running simultaneously in the alluvial substrate and the bedrock beneath it. The first weapon's detonation, corrected by the telemetry data to the actual boundary depth, placed the explosive yield at the transition between the sediment and bedrock layers, the zone of maximum impedance mismatch, where the pressure waves transmission characteristics changed abruptly and generated the reflected overpressure loading that the weapons engineers had modeled as optimal for compromising the chamber ceilings. The chamber ceilings failed, not completely. The hardened concrete cap that the facility's engineers had designed as the primary structural protection performed within its design parameters for the load it was designed to resist. The load it received was not within its design parameters. The reflected overpressure exceeded the design load by a margin that produced cracking in the ceiling structure across a lateral extent of the primary storage chamber that was sufficient to allow the second weapon's blast pressure to enter the chamber through the fracture network, rather than requiring it to breach the ceiling intact. The second weapon's detonation, guided by the corrected fuzing solution to a depth inside the fracture zone created by the first, transmitted its yield through the compromised ceiling directly into the storage chamber. The loitering munitions stored there, the Shahed-series airframes, their warheads, their propellant charges, the fuzing systems fitted and verified and awaiting deployment, experienced the overpressure simultaneously. The sympathetic detonations that followed were a cascade. Seismic stations registered a primary signature from the B-2's weapons employment, followed by a secondary signature 44 seconds later that was, in energy release, significantly larger than the first. The secondary signature was the stored ordnance, consuming itself inside a chamber that containment had transformed from a protection into a vessel. The base's surface garrison registered the seismic event at 8:38 p.m. as a tremor that shattered windows in the administrative block and triggered every vibration sensor in the base's perimeter security system simultaneously. The duty officer in the base security center looked at a display showing every perimeter sensor in alarm state and a seismic reading that his equipment characterized as a 2.9 magnitude event directly beneath the southwestern apron. He attempted to reach the underground facility's surface interface panel. No response. He attempted the emergency intercom. No response. At 8:41 p.m., 3 minutes after the first weapon's impact, the secondary detonation from the stored ordnance produced a surface manifestation. A section of the southwestern apron, 11 meters in diameter, subsided 40 centimeters as the chamber beneath it partially collapsed under the combined loading of the two weapons and the sympathetic detonation of its contents. The subsidence was visible to the security perimeter cameras. The duty officer was watching the perimeter camera feeds when it happened. He did not need any further information to understand what had occurred. He picked up the command line and began reporting. His report was the first accurate external characterization of what had happened beneath the apron, and it arrived at the Regional Command Authority at 8:47 p.m., 9 minutes after the B-2 had released its first weapon and 412 miles into the aircraft's egress track. The B-2 reached its post-strike tanker rendezvous at 11:23 p.m. The transfer completed without incident. The aircraft continued west. The data link carried a single confirmation code that the mission planners had been waiting for since the execution order went out. The code confirmed weapons employment and egress. The planners had assessed, based on the seismic data from regional monitoring stations, that their intelligence feed was pulling in real time, that the sympathetic detonation had occurred. The seismic signature was consistent with a large secondary event inside a contained space. They did not have visual confirmation yet. They had physics. Physics was sufficient. The numbers that closed the mission. 11 hours and 44 minutes of flight time. 2 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators employed at a 31-second interval. 1 Raad fire control radar activation that generated 2 clean sweeps against a target 4 kilometers beyond its effective acquisition range. 1 telemetry-corrected fuzing solution that adjusted detonation depth by 6 meters against a geological variable that the pre-mission survey had not resolved. 44 seconds between the first weapon's detonation and the sympathetic secondary event that destroyed the chamber's contents. 0 aircraft lost. 0 crew from the strike package. The storage and pre-launch preparation facility that housed the single-site loitering munition stockpile, assessed as capable of simultaneously saturating every major U.S. installation in the region, was gone. Not disabled, not degraded, but consumed by the energy of its own contents in a sequence that the mission had initiated and that physics had completed. A weapon designed to be produced in overwhelming numbers derives its strategic value from the accumulation of those numbers at a location where they can be directed. Remove the location, and the production continues elsewhere. But the accumulation that existed at Shahid Babaei did not continue to exist anywhere. The mathematics of saturation require a specific quantity. That quantity had been subtracted from the calculus before the sum could be used. The apron holds its subsidence. The chamber beneath it holds its silence. The drones that were stored there will not fly.